hear me? I guess.
Pretty good shape. He moved over a little bit. Shall I go ahead and introduce him? Yeah, let him move it over. He'll be here in a minute. Good afternoon. This is the third of our lecture series, and today we get an opportunity to get some background, historical background of what led up to the Holocaust. And our speaker today is Professor Robert Brown. You all know him pretty well because he's been here from the start and spoke on our first day. Dr. did his undergraduate work at Johns Hopkins University and did his graduate work in France and got his doctorate at the University of Paris. But he's been here at Sonoma State, I think it's since 1967?
Yes.
And in the history department, and he's been but I want to say that in terms of our study here in the Holocaust, Dr. Brown has been one of the key members of the faculty whose interest started at the very beginning, and he's going to give you the background for those of you who are not sure about what happened in Europe in the years preceding World War II. He'll fill you in. So it's my pleasure now to welcome Professor Robert Brown.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for that introduction. You've seen me before, and I guess you knew before the introduction that I am a member of the history department. And I would like to talk about the historical context of the Holocaust. Let me explain what I'll do. I want to run over some events fairly quickly, but I will underline some aspects of the development of the Holocaust more in depth than others. I have about 80 slides that trace the development of the Holocaust, and I'm going to try to get through my introductory remarks and work the slides into it, and leave sufficient time for any questions that can be handled after the slide lecture. So let me start by saying that I hope you all saw the film Night and Fog and thought a little bit about it between last week and today. And I would think that one of the main questions that would come out of Night and Fog is the simple question: how did it happen? Why did it happen? Under what circumstances did the scenes portrayed in Night and Fog come about? What was reputed to be one of the most civilized countries in the world, Germany. There's no doubt that Germany, in its history, had added greatly to the idea of Western culture, and it's very difficult to understand how the Holocaust came about. I do believe the Holocaust is a crucial event in contemporary history. It's filled with meaning on many levels. And first and foremost, the Holocaust is most meaningful for the Jewish people. The Holocaust was an extremely traumatic, probably the most traumatic event in the history of the Jewish people. I am not Jewish. I identify with New England. I'm a WASP, as the sociologists say, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and I certainly don't want to minimize the uniqueness of the Holocaust to the Jewish community. It certainly is a crucial event in the history of that community. I would recall the words of Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish philosopher historian, and I partially agree at least with the sense of those words, that human beings have no nature, he said, they have history. And history is different for different people. But it is a powerful shaper of human life and one's comprehension of human life. Obviously, if different people have a different historical experience, they're going to look at the world much differently. History can bring people together, or it can separate them. Depending upon our own life experiences, we are more or less together in this world. I tend to stress, having said that as an introduction, I tend to stress, I think in part because of my background, the universal meaning of the Holocaust. I had no family who died in the camps. I grew up in a community that had housing restrictions, and while there were Jewish students in the schools that I went to, there were very few. There were no blacks, and my educational background was essentially one in a community that felt itself to be very secure, to be a part of the majority. I would argue that makes an awful lot of difference in the lives of people, whether you think you're part of the majority or part of the minority. To me, the meaning of the Holocaust is tied into the idea that it represents the utter failure of toleration, of compassion, of human solidarity, and that the Holocaust is essentially about the mass murder of a particular people. The genocide, to use a more appropriate term, I think, the genocide of an entire people. Last week, again, we saw the graphic consequences of that genocide in Night and Fog. And the question I would like to address today is simply the one, how did it happen? Why did it happen? I believe that history can provide many of the answers to that question, but not all. Because as you read through the literature on the Holocaust, you become more and more aware that there are parts of the Holocaust that defy comprehension. You really, you try to understand it in a rational way, and what you run into is a barrier that a lot of your understandings are emotional, that there are limits to reason and rational explanations of historical events. And you will find, coming back time and time again, for people who have studied the Holocaust, the idea that there is a part of it that will always be incomprehensible to human beings. I would begin my explanation of the Holocaust in terms of a quotation that I've taken from Arno Mayer, who has written much about the Holocaust. And the idea is that in order to understand the Holocaust, you have to recall the centrality of ideology, politics, and war in human affairs. Well, the ideology was fascism. The politics of the period were totalitarian, which really, one definition of totalitarianism, I believe, would be the denial of the values of individualism and toleration. And of course, war was used as a means to achieve the goals of fascism. What I want to do very quickly, I hope by this time all of you have gotten the handout, actually 5 pages. 2 of the pages are front and back. And what I want to do is to talk very quickly about some of these topics under the outline. You'll find, you might just take, while you're shuffling through the papers, you might just take a look at the other pages. One is a series of notes written by Adolf Hitler early in the 1920s, when he spoke about his views on politics. Another is an indication of the Jewish populations in various countries in Europe at the beginning of World War II. Then there's an indication, an excerpt from an article by Raoul Hilberg, the statistic, in a book called Unanswered Questions, which are essays about the Holocaust, which approximates the losses in the Holocaust slightly over 5 million. You normally will hear the figure between 5 and 6 million. In all probability, we will never know the exact number. And then the final map is of the various kinds of camps. There were different kinds of camps in the German system, ranging from concentration camps to death camps, and there are various kinds of transit camps and the like. Let me just say that the Holocaust, I think, begins in the German defeat of World War I. There were great political changes in Germany. There were great geographical and political changes, and the hatred, which I think is reflected by the Holocaust, essentially comes from an inability on the part of certain Germans to gain control of that element of the German population who could not accept the defeat of World War I. Prior to World War I, Germany was acknowledged to be the most dominant and the most powerful country on the European continent. The only real rival in Europe to Germany was Great Britain. But Germany, since 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, had been dominant on the continent. And the impact of the war was felt after 4 years of a very bitter and brutal war. Millions of German soldiers were killed. The Versailles Treaty reflected the depths of the German defeat. That there were essentially three elements of the Versailles Treaty. Before I get to that, just let me say that the war brought about great political changes. At the end of the war, the German Empire was overthrown, which meant that the German Kaiser fled into exile and lived the rest of his life in Holland. A German Republic was established under the leadership of the Social Democratic Party, which was a socialist party, but one that was not communistic. It was not a revolutionary socialist party, although it established itself upon the ruins of the German Empire. It appeared that liberalism had triumphed at the end of World War I, and liberalism was represented by the values and the institutions that were followed in countries like Great Britain, France, and the United States. If you'll recall, in 1917, the Russian Empire fell apart, and the Russian Revolution seized power under the Bolsheviks, or the Communists, or the Revolutionary Socialists, however you want to call them. The Russian Revolution brought revolutionary socialism to power became the Soviet Union. So that, but at that time, 1917, Russia was engaged in a civil war. It could not play its normal role in Europe. Germany had been disastrously defeated. It appeared that France and Great Britain and the United States more or less had taken control of the European world. And in a sense that meant the world, because given the vast colonial empires of certainly France and the United States, France and Britain, and to a lesser degree perhaps the United States, the influence and power of those countries was in fact worldwide. But that triumph of liberalism was more apparent than real, because France and Great Britain had been deeply injured by world. They had lost a great many soldiers, and they had also paid a very heavy material price for waging a war for 4 years. So they were far weaker than they appeared in 1918. Well, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, and David Lloyd George of Great Britain essentially were the dominant figures at the Versailles Treaty. Germany, without going into the details, Germany was very heavily punished in terms of reparations. They were to pay millions of dollars to France in particular, and other countries in Europe that had been damaged by the war. Germany lost a large amount of its territory. It was given to other countries, particularly Poland. And Germany's military was 100,000 men. In terms of Germany's, the whole point of the Versailles Treaty was clearly to try to injure Germany and restrict Germany so that it could not again wage war in Europe within the near future. The provisions of the treaty ended up being forced on the Germans. The German president under the Weimar Republic, which was essentially in its values and institutions of liberalism, representative government, individual rights, the Weimar Republic was forced to sign the treaty. It was done under the threat of the military occupation of Germany if they did not sign. And finally, the Germans at first didn't want to sign the treaty. They said, this treaty is impossible. We can't live under this treaty. But finally, Matthias Erzberger came forward. He was later to be assassinated in the 20s by a German nationalist who hated him because he had signed the treaty. But Erzberger came forward and said, rather than have a military occupation, I'll sign the treaty. And that did not prevent Germany from, that did not permit, I should say, Germany to become a stable republic overnight. In fact, there was deep revulsion by many, many people, even those who accepted the Weimar Republic, thought that the Versailles Treaty was simply unacceptable. It was a wound to German nationalism and the German sense of their own identity. But so that you had this situation in the early Weimar Republic where Germany had, in its history for the first time, the most representative democratic formality that had ever existed in German history. And yet probably the majority of Germans hated it because it had been imposed upon them by the Treaty of Versailles. The Weimar Republic is a time of turmoil. In fact, beginning in 1918 with the overthrow of the old German monarchy, the old German Empire under the Hohenzollerns, Germany had been in turmoil. There were German nationalists on the right, had the provisions of the Versailles Treaty done away with. There were German communists and socialists on the left who wanted Germany to establish a socialist republic. There were people in the middle who supported the Weimar Republic, and yet the Weimar Republic was essentially a very weak form of government because of the means by which it had been imposed. I'll skip over of territory by simply saying that Hitler, in the period between 1920 and 1933, pursued political power with an energy and in many ways a rare political ability that finally brought him, after a great many ups and downs, to power on January the 30th, 1933. I don't want to go in detail. You'll see some of this in the slides. I don't want to go into too much detail. The essential thing is that Hitler proved himself to be a very capable political leader. He represented the hatred and the disenchantment that many Germans felt. And he was a man who led eventually in 1933. In 1923, he tried to putsch in Bavaria, in Munich actually, tried with the government, and he was arrested and put in jail, and there he wrote Mein Kampf, and he came out of jail and continued to try to agitate and to make the Nazi Party into a powerful political organization in the Weimar Republic. He wasn't terribly successful until the Great Depression hit in 1930. And then Hitler's party made amazing strides. And he was finally invited to become the German Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. Now, Hitler represented fascism as an ideology, And I think here I need to define fascism very quickly. Fascism is a set of beliefs. Any ideology is a set of beliefs, and fascism believed very ardently in nationalism, and in racism. It was anti-liberal, so it opposed the kind of historical liberalism that had grown up in Britain, France, and the United States. It was anti-Marxist, so it opposed what had happened in the Soviet Union. It was anti-intellectual. You can define an ideology, I think, in terms of what it stands for and promotes and what it stands against and denigrates. Essentially within that ideology, if you talk about, for example, militarism and nationalism, you can find plenty of nationalism and militarism, I suppose, in certain of the liberal societies. But what I think defined German fascism in particular was its racism and its ideology of separation, what Hitler deeply believed in. And that belief, I think, was largely irrational. Hitler essentially argued in the form of conclusions. I mean, he never really addressed evidence. He would make statements, dogmatic statements, that this was the way things were. I'll give you an example or two of them. But Hitler believed deeply in the politics of separation, which was, at its core, a racial view of history. The Germans were an inferior race. All other races in the world were inferior, and particularly the Jews. They were the particular target of German fascism. Although German fascism was also hostile to Africans, it was hostile to Slavic peoples of Europe, both of whom were considered to be inferior to the Aryan or the German. The racial component of German fascism, I think, is what really defines it most concretely. As early as in Hitler's book Mein Kampf, which he wrote while he was in prison in the mid-20s, Hitler spoke of becoming an anti-Semite in Vienna in the years before World War I. And in 1919, there exists a letter in which Hitler quite openly and candidly displayed his view of the world and his view of the Jews. And I better back up here and say there is a dispute within people who study the Holocaust on the degree to which anti-Semitism is religiously based, that is, in the traditional and age-old conflict between Jews and Christians on a religious basis, and the degree to which it was racially based. That is, Hitler believed that the Jews were biologically a different people than the Germans. And it does seem to me that the evidence is persuasive, at least to me, that the real power of German anti-Semitism, or if you want fascist, Nazi anti-Semitism, lay in its acceptance of the idea that the Jews were racially different from the Germans and other. In 1919, Hitler wrote the following statement, quote, "To begin with, the Jews are unquestionably a race, not a religious community. Through inbreeding for thousands of years, the Jew has been able to preserve his race and his racial characteristics much more successfully than most of the numerous people among whom he lives. As a result, we have living in our midst a non-German alien race, unwilling and indeed unable to shed its racial characteristics. Everything that makes people strive for greater things," Hitler goes on, "be it religion, socialism, or democracy, merely serves the Jew as a means to the satisfaction of his greed and thirst for power. The result of his works is racial tuberculosis of the nation," unquote. Hitler's racism went beyond the Jews, as I've already indicated, although he remained their principal target throughout his period of power. There's an interesting confrontation between a fellow Nazi, Otto Strasser, who in some ways was opposed to some of the ideas that Hitler stood for, particularly some of the racial separatist ideas. And at a Nazi party meeting in 1930, before Hitler came to power, Otto Strasser and Hitler got into a confrontation at a Nazi party meeting, where when Otto Strasser got up and said that it would be politically smart for the Nazis to support the oppressed masses in the colonies, because after all they were mostly in the colonies of Great Britain and France, and Strasser called for the emancipation of India and friendship with the Soviet Union. Now, as a political unquote, Hitler then went on to define, and this was before his Nazi faithful, Hitler went on to define his own vision of the Nazi revolution. Quote, "There is only one possible kind of revolution, and it is not economic or political or social, it is racial. All revolutions, and I have studied them all," Hitler claimed, "have been racial." Speaking of Strasser, "Your ideas of foreign policy are false because you have no racial knowledge. Did you not declare openly for the Indian independence movement when it was obviously a rebellion of the inferior Hindu race against the superior Anglo-Nordic race? The Nordic race has the right to dominate the world, and that right will be the guiding principle of our foreign policy. That is why any alliance with the Soviet Union, a Slavic Tatar body surmounted by a Jewish head, is out of the question," unquote. In fact, you can see in the note attached on Hitler's speech early in the 1920s, this constant identification of the Jews with Bolshevism, with capitalism, even with internationalism, with the Versailles Treaty, all the things that Hitler did not like, he claimed that the Jews were behind them. And of course, from the quotes that I've already given you, and I could literally give you hundreds and hundreds of quotes along the same lines, Hitler deeply believed in the separation of the Germanic peoples from the rest of the peoples of the world, believed that the Germanic people or the Aryan people had a right to world domination. Well, Hitler came to power in 1933, but essentially his power was untested. All he had proved himself to be in 1933 was a capable political leader of a party which never got the majority in Germany, but which became the largest party in the Reichstag in 1932. And finally, old Field Marshal von Hindenburg, the president of Germany, agreed to permit Hitler to become the Chancellor of Germany. Now, something which I think in Holocaust studies is not stressed enough is the idea that Hitler had given no proofs of his ability in 1933, outside of the fact that he had organized a party that had become a major in the Weimar Republic. Hitler's real test of power, I think, and his real test of credibility lay in the years 1933 down through 1941, when Hitler put together an astonishing set of political triumphs inside Germany, diplomatic triumphs with the former nations that had defeated him, France and defeated Germany, I should say, France and Great Britain. And then by 1941, Hitler's armies had rolled over most of Western and Central Europe, and they were preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union. So I think it needs to be stressed more than it has been in historical studies that Hitler, when he came to power in 1933, lacked a certain amount of credibility, that shown political talent, but what he was going to do was unclear. As a matter of fact, when Hitler was given the chancellorship by Hindenburg, it had been argued by Hindenburg's supporters that Hitler would be manipulated by other people, and for that reason, he wasn't such a threat to power. I came across very recently an interesting letter that Ludendorff tried to make the putsch with Hitler in 1923. Actually wrote the aging president of Germany, Field Marshal von Hindenburg, wrote him a letter saying, after Hindenburg had appointed Hitler chancellor, Ludendorff wrote a letter saying, "You've appointed a very evil man to a position of power, and you're going to regret the rest of your life." Hindenburg didn't live very long. "You're going to regret the rest of your life you ever appointed him to power, and that people will curse you in the future for having done so after you're dead." In a curious way, Ludendorff's statement proved to be true. So what did Hitler do? Well, one of the first things he did was to purge his own party. There had been some disagreement between the leading members of Hitler's party and himself. In the famous Night of the Long Knives in 1904, Hitler had a number of his opponents within the Nazi party assassinated, including Gregor Strasser, the brother of the man that Hitler had disagreed with so vehemently in 1930. Generally, the Strasser brothers represented a leftist element within the Nazi party who wanted the Nazi party to appeal more to the workers. And Hitler saw them as because they threatened his alliance with the more traditional and conservative ruling elements of German society, like the military in particular, the conservative landlords, the Junker landlords of Prussia. But so that Hitler showed his willingness certainly to use violence against his own people, and this becomes characteristic of Hitler's policies, that he was always to use violence, great violence, in the pursuit of his goals. In 1935, Hitler promulgated, I should back up and say that Hitler, when he came to power, was simply the chancellor of the Reichstag. And there was a Reichstag fire blamed on a communist, which permitted Hitler to manipulate the Reichstag into banning the Communist Party, which had the beneficial effect for the Nazis of giving them the majority in the Reichstag. They promptly used that majority to pass an enabling act, which gave Hitler dictatorial powers for 4 years. It was supposed to be renewed, but after 4 years, Hitler was solidly in control, and there was no need to renew the 4-year dictatorship. In 1935, between 33 and 35, German Jews, who were legal citizens of Germany, were constantly the object of attacks. Many of the shops owned by Jews were sacked, and but in 1935, the German Reichstag actually came back and met in Nuremberg to pass the infamous Nuremberg laws, which said essentially that a Jew was no longer a citizen of Germany, that they had no right to vote, they could not hold political office, and the Nuremberg laws have stood for this politics of separation and exclusion that was so much a part of Hitler's vision of the world. From that time on, things got continually worse for the Jews who were in Germany. It looks very much like the initial policy of Hitler was to make life so uncomfortable in Germany for German Jews that they would immigrate to another country. Of course, this gets into the politics of immigration under the Third Reich. And the idea that during the 1930s, other countries in the world, including the United States, were only willing to accept so many Jews into the United States. There were quotas in countries like Canada and the United States and Great Britain. And generally speaking, the idea a large number of people would be coming into the United States in the midst of the Depression was a difficult one for the American authorities. Here's as a matter of fact, I mean, if you're talking about immigration policies in different countries in the world, here I think the more traditional form of racism, based on religion, might have played a very important role. There have been studies to show that immigration authorities were anti-Semitic and often created obstacles to the immigration of German Jews and later Austrian Jews into the United States. We're kind of moving on. Let me just run off a number of the diplomatic victories that Hitler achieved, and they're more or less listed. German rearmament in violation of the Versailles Treaty. The occupation of the Rhineland in 1936, violation of the Versailles Treaty. German annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, which had been forbidden by the Versailles Treaty. The Munich crisis of 1938, Hitler essentially got Daladier of France and Neville Chamberlain of Britain to agree to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Munich crisis in 1938 essentially was a diplomatic triumph of enormous proportions for Hitler. It fit into his view of the world. He felt, perhaps intuitively, that Great Britain and France did not want to fight Nazi Germany, and he used that very effectively at Munich. There's been much written about the policies of France, and here we have to keep in mind that all through this period between the two world wars, there was a tremendous ideological conflict between communism and fascism, which was an international movement. Communism was an international movement, and liberalism. And the leaders of Great Britain and France both believed that fascism and communism were unacceptable. They liked both of them, they were opposed to both of them, and really what they hoped was, clearly Chamberlain hoped, that somewhere along the line, that fascism and communism would get into a fight between themselves. And although that did happen in 1941, Germany did invade the Soviet Union, but that was only after Germany had conquered most of Europe, including France, and at the time of the invasion of the Soviet Union, Britain was alone against the power of Germany. Crystal Night is a result. There was in France, in the German consulate in France, German embassy, a German official was shot to death by a Jew, which unleashed in Germany a savagery upon German Jews. They were murdered on the streets. Hundreds were killed, apparently, in that night. And it seems to me that all the way through, up to the outbreak of World War I, it can be argued that the policies followed by Hitler showed not only a kind of astonishing success, and I would argue that his credibility grew with every success that he had, but a pronounced willingness on the part to use violence to achieve his political goals. Probably the most cynical agreement made by Hitler was the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Before that, the Nazis were the sworn enemies of the Communists, Soviet Union. Hitler continually referred to the Bolsheviks as essentially being Jews. But in August of 1939, prior to the invasion of Poland, Hitler came to an agreement with the Soviet Union that divided Poland between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The invasion of Poland kicked off World War I, and we come really to the final part, the final solution. And I'd just like to indicate that the final solution, which was the extermination or the mass murder of the Jewish community of Europe, as the end step in a series of steps that had included first a kind of policy of forced immigration. Clearly from 1933 to about 1938, Hitler's main policy seemed to be, with regard to the Jews, to force them out of Germany. But after the invasion of Poland and the rapid defeat of Poland, and later on, of course, with the invasion, France and Great Britain finally decided to enter the war against Germany and declared war on Germany because Poland's borders had been guaranteed by the treaties after World War I. The policy of immigration of necessity changed. And it's been shown that as late as the summer of 1940, Hitler talked about banishing the Jews of Europe. Keep in mind, by conquering Poland and by conquering France, conquering Czechoslovakia, Germany not now had to deal not only with the Jews that had been in Austria and Germany, who had previously been citizens, he had to deal with millions and millions of Jews in the conquered territories. So Hitler first thought and talked about a plan, the so-called Madagascar plan, to banish the Jews of Europe to Madagascar, and continued to talk about that plan until 1940. With the invasion of Russia, or the Soviet Union, in June of 1941, Hitler ordered the establishment of what were called the Einsatzgruppen. They were special units charged with murdering commissars, Jews, and gypsies, wherever the German army conquered in the Soviet Union. And the Einsatzgruppen, there were Group A, B, C, and D. The map of the Soviet Union was divided up into sections A, B, C, and D. And they simply went out in to those areas and rounded up as many people as they could find and simply shot them to death on the spot. Usually they had to they had to dig their own graves, and thousands and thousands of people were murdered in that way. As the Germans thought more about it, the situation of how going to free Europe of the Jews, those were the terms in which the Germans put the problem. The final solution evolved, and the first clear indication of it was in an order from Hermann Goering, who was the second in command to Hitler, on July the 31st, 1941. And Goering was writing to a man named Richard Heydrich, who was in charge of problems relating to Jews in Germany and outside of Germany in the occupied zones. And what Goering said was in this letter was that the previous policy was one of forced immigration. Since the war has come about, that's difficult to do. And Goering wrote, "I herewith charge you with making all necessary preparations with regard to organizational, practical, and financial aspects for an overall solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. Insofar as competencies of other central organizations are affected, these are to be involved. I further charge you with submitting to me promptly an overall plan of the preliminary, organizational, practical, and financial for the execution of the intended final solution of the Jewish question," unquote. That, in response to that order, it was Richard Heydrich who convened in January of 1942 the Wannsee Conference in a suburb in Germany, where leading members, not Hitler, not Goering, not Himmler, but other leading members of the Nazi hierarchy gathered and essentially established the plans for the evacuation and the extermination of European Jews. Let me stop there, and I want to put on some slides and quickly run through some of what I've just said. Okay, here's a. Get back on the microphone. Here's a sketch of Hitler as a young man. He was only 16, and a schoolmate made this sketch of Hitler. Remember, Hitler was an Austrian, born in Austria, but he decided to go into the German army. And this is a picture at the outbreak of World War I, and Hitler was actually found. I don't know whoever found him in this huge crowd. And identified him as a very willing participant in World War I. Here he is in kind of I call it an ecstasy of enthusiasm for the war. Here is Hitler with the X over his head. During World War I, he was a very brave soldier. He received the Iron Cross, which was a very high military decoration. He was promoted to be corporal, and he served through the war with distinction. Here's Hitler in jail after the failed in Munich. Within jail, that he wrote Mein Kampf, which is an extraordinary book. I mean, it's kind of a straightforward account of his racial view of the world. Here's Germany in 1914. Up on the left, you can see the extent of the German and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was under the domination of the German Habsburg dynasty. And then in 1920, you can see that the Habsburg Empire was all broken up into new countries, and that Germany, in fact, had lost considerable land to Poland. Here's one of the posters for the Nazis during the 1920s in their election. In one of their elections, it essentially says, vote, just come down a little, vote for the Nazis or his sacrifice will have been in vain. Of course, the Nazis deliberately tried to appeal to the memory of the soldiers who had died in World War I as their friends and supporters. Here's another. This is it might be useful, Phil. Maybe you could get into the booth there. I think it's open, and get it down a little bit. This is a social democratic poster that says essentially to vote for the Social Democrats against the bourgeoisie, the Burger Bloc, and the Hakenkreuz, which is German for swastika. Here's the Karl Liebknecht building, Karl Liebknecht in Luxembourg, were German communists who were killed in 1919 in street fighting in Berlin. And this was the Karl Liebknecht, whoops. Good, thank you. This was the Communist Party headquarters in Berlin, and it has slogans like union with the Soviet Union and for a free and socialist Germany. It was the intense ideological struggles that went on in the 1920s and 30s, early 30s. Here's the German Reichstag. The empty seats are the seats of the Nazi Party. The speaker was a social democrat. Whenever he got up to speak, the Nazis would simply file out. They didn't want to hear anything from the social democrats. That was just so much socialism and so much Bolshevism. Okay, and here we have another Nazi poster, Our Last Hope, Hitler. And here Hitler is playing upon the unemployment in Germany in the 1930s. And Hitler got involved in a presidential election with Hindenburg, and there were four people in the election. And Hitler came in second, so there had to be a runoff election. And what this is indicating is that Hindenburg supporters are calling for a second blow against the Nazis in the runoff election, and they're using the hammer of 18.6 million ballots for Hindenburg. Hitler got about 11.5 million ballots in this election. The poster which says no to the raises the question, do you want a Third Reich? The answer is no. This is a poster of the Social Democrats who were opposed to the Nazis. And in fact, the poster is a kind of an eerie forewarning, if you want, of what Nazism would mean to the world and to Germany. Here's a young German supporter arrested in 1902. He's being led off by a policeman. He's giving the fascist salute, and you can see some of the people in the crowd are returning the fascist salute. Hitler and the Nazis had incredible strength among young people in Germany. And Hitler made a very strong appeal to the youth of Germany. In fact, he made it clearly evident that the salvation of Germany, the Nazi Revolution, upon the adherence of young people. And he was very successful in gaining the adherence of many young people. Here's the another election poster, and basically it's a social democratic poster opposed to the Nazis. It shows what would happen to the worker if the Nazis came to power in Germany, that is, crucified upon the swastika. This is a Nazi poster which essentially says that only one man can save us from the monster of Bolshevism or communism, and that man is Adolf Hitler. Again, that tremendous tension and ideological dispute that went on in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. This is Kurt von Schleicher, who was the German chancellor before Hitler came to power. He thought that he could manipulate Hitler to some degree. He found out otherwise because he was one of the victims of the Night of the Long Knives. In 1934, he was assassinated by the Nazis. This is the scene from the Reichstag fire, which was instrumental in the Nazis coming to power because the Communist Party was outlawed, and that gave the Nazi Party a majority so that they could put the Enabling Act with the support of some other nationalist parties. Here's Hitler taking the oath of the office of Chancellor. There's old President von Hindenburg sitting before him. Here's some members of the German SA, the brown shirts. They're being congratulated for having enrolled in Hitler's private army. Actually, there were something like 2 or 3 million brown shirts when in power. There were something like 2 to 3 million brown shirts enrolled in Hitler's what was amounted to his own private army, or in the Nazi army. And at one time, the Nazis wanted to enroll all of these brown shirts into the German army, and the German officer corps was horrified at the idea, and essentially resisted it. Although, as part of the compromise, increasingly the German high command became supporters of Hitler. Here are the brown shirts in action. That once the Nazis came to power, they started to take action against their political enemies, socialists and communists for the most part, and essentially used police powers. Some of them were turned into auxiliary police, and they used police powers to take action of these men that you see lined up here. They were the first people who went to concentration camps were the political opponents of Hitler. Here are German students with Nazis burning books, books written by people like Albert Einstein, Erich Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front. They were burned. All Quiet was burned because it was considered to be an anti-war book. And the Nazis, to say the least, were not anti-war. Here's Ernst Röhm. He was the leader of the brown shirts until he was assassinated by the Nazis in 1934 in the Night of the Long Knives. This is Alfred Hugenberg. He was not a Nazi really. He was a leader of the Nationalist Party, sympathetic to the Nazis. He actually went into Hitler's government in 1933. Hitler promptly dissolved the party of Hugenberg. Here is Hitler at Nuremberg, the place for the great Nazi rallies. There were huge rallies of the party faithful. The place was in Nuremberg, in Bavaria, in Germany. And there's Hitler with Himmler and I think Rudolf Hess saluting the so-called Blood Banner. It was in the people who had died in the Putsch in 1923. Here's Hitler promulgating the Nuremberg laws of 1935. It was actually done, as the name implies, it was done in Nuremberg, so the laws against the Jews took the name, the Nuremberg laws. Here's Hitler congratulating young people. Again, that appeals to German youth. Here are German women. Hitler, the Nazis had a young women's organization. The young women never fought, but the Nazis liked the idea of discipline. In fact, the traditional Nazi view of women was that they were essentially homemakers, and they should produce offspring for the fatherland. Here's a cartoon of the Russian. This essentially says Chinese honey and Spanish honey and peace blossom honey. It implies that the Russians were simply, the Soviet Union was simply out to grab whatever they could in any part of the world. There was at least early in the 1930s, there was the belief that there might be some kind of an alliance between the Soviet Union and Great Britain. And this is to indicate that outwardly the Russians were saying good things about Britain, but underground they were working to destroy the structure of British society. Here was the result of the plebiscite in the Saarland in 1935 under the Versailles Treaty. For all practices, the great coal basin of Germany, the Saar, was exploited by France. But in 1935 there was a plebiscite on the question of which country the Saar wanted to belong to, and it was an overwhelming victory. Well over 90% of the people in the Saar wanted to be reattached to Germany. Here's von Schuschnigg in Austria. Von Schuschnigg was the Austrian chancellor who wanted to have a plebiscite on the issue of the union of Germany and Austria. He was opposed to the Nazis. So Hitler gave orders to the Austrian Nazis to create disturbances so that the plebiscite could not be held. And in fact, the plebiscite was canceled. Here's a group of Austrians with the banner that says, "For an Austria without von Schuschnigg." And in fact, he was removed from power. This is Seyss-Inquart, who became the governor of Austria after the union with the Nazis. He later became a kind of a high commissioner in occupied Holland and played a very important role in the destruction of the Jews in Holland. They were evacuated from Holland and sent to death camps. He was tried at Nuremberg and hanged as a result of his conduct during World War II. Here's Adolf Hitler plots the city square in the center of Vienna. The name was changed from essentially the city square, Adolf Hitler Square. And here was the Austrian plebiscite. If you wanted Adolf Hitler to unify Austria and Germany, you were to vote yes. This plebiscite was held actually in Germany and in Austria. And if you didn't want it, it was no. Well, the results were, in Germany, 99.08% of the people voted for the Anschluss, the union of Austria and Germany. And the vote was 99.75. Here's Hitler with Neville Chamberlain. Here is Chamberlain after Munich holding up the famous paper which he claimed was peace in our time, and war broke out a little more than a year later. Here's one of the adulatory paintings of Adolf Hitler. There were hundreds and hundreds of these made in the Reich, Third Reich. This is the image that Hitler or the Nazis sought to portray of German women. They were mothers and caretakers, and the background here suggests that she is a peasant woman. And then here's another. The Nazis constantly had that it was in the rural population, the peasant population of Germany, that the basic racial strength of Germany lay. And so they tried to ennoble the peasantry in their propaganda. Here's a German student. Hitler was very successful with young people in Germany, and here the German student for the Fuhrer and the German people. Here is the caption on this is a very young stormtrooper. Here is Hitler and Goering after the defeat of France in 1940. They're on a balcony in Berlin. Here's Rudolf Hess before the German party at Nuremberg. Hess was actually the number 3 man in the Nazi party after Hitler and Goering, and then Hess was the deputy Fuhrer of the Nazi party. Here's Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. He died with Hitler in the bunker when he committed suicide along with Hitler in 1945. Here's Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the Gestapo, and he's with the head of the Austrian police, Victor Luga, I think. De Luga. And Martin Bormann, whose whereabouts are still unknown. Some people believe he died in Berlin in 1945. Others believe that he's still alive. And he is actively researched by people who want to punish the criminals of World War II. Albert Speer and Adolf Hitler. This is Eva Braun. This was supposed to be the photograph of Hitler's mistress, finally his wife, just before he died. This was supposed to be Hitler's favorite photo of Eva Braun. And here's Eva Braun and Hitler at a art exhibit. This essentially said this was before Hitler came to power in 1933. Germans, defend yourself, do not buy from the Jews. Here's a poster, a Nazi poster, showing a Jew destroying the dove of peace, standing on the bones of, or standing on the foundation of strikes, liberty, equality, fraternity, class warfare, and you get the idea. Here's a Jew being humiliated in Berlin, that Jews essentially were denied the right to work in professions, and they were often humiliated by being made to do menial jobs under the supervision of SA men or German police. This is actually a Polish emblem that the Poles in Germany, as I've said before, not only the Jews were singled out, but Poles in Germany had to wear a P for Polish. Here is a cartoon of Hitler by a British cartoonist. John Hartfield was a British cartoonist who showed Hitler essentially, I suppose, a mad militarist. And here is, this is kind of a play on the idea that the cock represents France, and the comment is that don't worry about Hitler, he's a vegetarian, although Hitler is sharpening his knife to cut up France. And here's the scare. This comes back to the ideological, the fear of Marxism. This is actually a French poster that says, be alert, French people, that communism has set fire to Spain and to the Soviet Union. This poster was obviously a poster by the French right. And here's a cartoon that shows the bully in the form of a German army soldier leaning over on all the countries in Europe. Here, keep in mind, fascism was an international movement, and Charles Lindbergh, with his America First movement, showed great sympathy for the Nazis. and he was only one of a number of them that essentially argued for isolationism on the grounds that the United States simply should not get involved in the ideological conflicts of Europe. Here's another British cartoon of Hitler. The posters and the cartoons are very insightful and very about the nature of politics between the wars. And here's the famous deal, the marriage of Hitler and Stalin in 1939, which permitted the invasion of Poland. And here's the invasion of Poland. German soldiers are pulling back barriers and getting ready to go into Poland. The Germans alleged that the Poles had fired on them, and they were just retaliating when they invaded Poland. Here's the German army attacking Poland, September the 1st, 1939, the start of World War II. And here's an Orthodox Jew being shaved by German soldiers after their conquest of Poland. And here's a anti-African poster. This was during the war, and essentially, do you want this to happen? And here's a cartoon of a Jew sitting upon a Christian cross that has a Star of David on it, which is marking the graves of Poles, Norwegians, Belgians, Dutch, French, English, Greek, Yugoslavians, Serbians, Africans, Russians, Asians, among the concentration camp, ovens, the execution of a prisoner. This was the scene at Belsen when the British troops arrived in 1945. This is Irma Greza, who was. Here's a scene where American soldiers are forcing the German citizens of a town in Volari, Germany, to march past 30 Jewish women who died of starvation on a march from Czechoslovakia. Here's a young German soldier captured at the end of the war by the American troops. And here's Nuremberg. And that's it. Let me just, if I can just kind of finish up quickly and say that by way of conclusion, it does seem to me that one can draw from the Holocaust many lessons. I think there are enormous political implications of the Holocaust. That there are a lot of warning signs that one can see in the development of the Holocaust. It's necessary to look hard, I think, at the ideology and the morality of that ideology. I'm talking, of course, of Nazism. Its exclusionary goals and its unwillingness to respect international law or just very basic standards of conduct between human beings. And then you can learn an awful lot about political methods, looking at the way power develops and how power becomes credible, how the use of military force and terror and the lack of restraint that was fundamental to a totalitarian government contributed to the development of the Holocaust. Certainly, a part of the Holocaust, I think, lies in the fact that Hitler became almost infallible, that he was so successful that in the end, by 1941, nobody really questioned his power, or very few people were willing to oppose his his commands. I think in the Holocaust there's a kind of, if you want, a kind of logical progression of increasing and unrestrained power. Hitler alone does not explain the Holocaust, although there is a certain amount of truth, I think, in the statement that without there would have been no Holocaust. Certainly Hitler empowered certain political ideas that were rampant in Germany in the 1920s and early 30s, prior to his accession to power. Hitler didn't lose. Certainly Hitler didn't lose World War I, and he didn't make the Versailles Treaty, and he didn't create the Depression, but he skillfully exploited all of those developments, many others. And also it should be kept in mind that millions of Nazis and Germans voted for him and eased his way to power. And once in power and once credible, they followed him explicitly. And it does seem to me that Hitler was an evil and destructive force in history. The Holocaust, in a very powerful way, will continue to define and test our understanding of the ideological, political, and moral dimensions of that endless search for a world based not on hatred, but on human solidarity. Thank you. If anybody has questions, and John, would you want to come down, and Phil and Bert, anybody else, we can all take our turn. This gentleman?
Yes, could you please speak to the issue of radio and its use during this particular time?
Well, Goebbels was a Nazi minister of propaganda. He was very effective. Some people claim that Goebbels was even more effective than Hitler. And Goebbels in particular used radio as his medium. It was very, the thing about Hitler, that a large part of his power to me came from his ability as a mass communicator. It's a very, very important political talent, and Hitler had it. This lady?
Yes, I would just like to add to, there's an enormous amount of material you've covered. You spoke about Kristallnacht in Germany. It was also in Austria. Austria today likes to let the world know that they were the first victims. A percentage of people voting for the Anschluss certainly makes that a lie. The other thing is, you seem to feel that Hitler was a very fine politician. Without the Jews...
Well, he was a capable politician. I don't want to use the word fine.
Okay, I appreciate that. Without the Jews to beat up on, do you think he would have gotten as far as he did? And without the nations outside, so cowardly and disrespectful of human life, do you think he would have gotten to where he did in being a capable politician?
Yeah, there has been an awful lot of work done on the degree to which anti-Semitism was a powerful influence on the development of Nazism, and some of the works are the conclusions are uneven. In some parts, that anti-Semitism was not a powerful force in the rise of Nazism. I think it was, but I think the Versailles Treaty was really the thing that outraged many, many Germans, and was really the foundation for the rise of a nationalist power in Germany who would promise to overturn the Versailles Treaty.
Well, given that that was probably so, still he could not have picked on any other victims to down that number of people. I mean, the people readily went along with it.
Yeah, but I mean, keep in mind that the whole sense of Hitler's anti-Semitism was that the Jews were in a conspiracy to take over the world. But if you look on that map, what you find is that 0.8% of the population of Germany was Jewish, and it almost defies common sense in many ways. It's not rational. I think it's irrational, and for Hitler to come to power, it wasn't just one thing. It's the fact that he put together a number of things very well in that rise to power. Let John.
I just wanted to say one thing which I think should be understood. Anti-Semitism was not the reason why Hitler came into power. In Spain.
One of the issues that has never been gone into very deeply was the degree to which the Japanese army acted throughout Asia in a racist sense. The Chinese claim somewhere between 10 and 20 million Chinese were killed by the Japanese during World War II. Extraordinary numbers. From time to time, the Chinese protest very vigorously about the way Japanese history books gloss over what happened in Asia. Very recently, the Japanese emperor made a visit to, I think it was Thailand. It was the first time since the end of World War II that the Japanese emperor had visited Thailand, and usually what happens is that there is an apology in various areas for what the Japanese army did in those countries during World War II. It's a continuing problem for many Asian countries when they view or when they remember what happened during World War II. Now, in addition to that, there was fascism in most of the countries in Europe. There was fascism in France, certainly. In fact, there was a slogan during the period of the Popular Front movement in France, which linked the French radicals with the French democratic socialists and the communists in a kind of block against the French right. And the slogan on the right became, "Better Hitler than Blum." Léon Blum was the leader of the Popular Front movement in France, and he was a socialist. But throughout Europe, throughout the world, there were fascist movements in the sense that they stood for exclusionary policies, which were violent, often very militaristic, and certainly there were overtones of racism. In this country, Father Coughlin, the well-known radio priest, is generally considered to at least have been very sympathetic to the rise of fascism in the world. And some people, although I think it's somewhat exaggerated, think of Huey Long in Louisiana as being a kind of semi-fascist anyway. But it was an international movement. Yes.
Comment on the Spanish Civil War as a prelude
Sure.
to World War II.
Sure. The Spanish Civil War was another example of Francisco Franco was, although he never allied militarily with Hitler, Franco always claimed that the damage done to Spain during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 39 essentially kept Spain, in the words of Franco, from actively supporting the military efforts of Nazi Germany. The Spanish did send a volunteer military unit to the Russian front that fought alongside of the German soldiers. And they suffered very heavy casualties. But Franco was certainly very sympathetic. He is a European fascist.
I have a three-part question. You mentioned that you saw German anti-Semitism with its roots in fascism.
In
German fascism.
No, its roots in a racial view of the world in biology rather than religion.
What the points that I wanted to ask you about were, wasn't German anti-Semitism more based since Martin Luther's anti-Semitic writings during the Reformation? The second part of that question then would also be about the other fascist dictator that was in alliance with Germany, was Mussolini, and his reluctance to give up his Jews. And then to sum up, I'd like you to, if you could, to draw the parallels between the Depression in the 30s and the 20s and the recession in the United States in the 90s and the David Duke and what the parallels are.
Well, let me begin with the easy one, Martin Luther. As I've already indicated, there is great dispute between people who write about the Holocaust over the degree to which traditional anti-Semitism based in religion is an explanation of the Holocaust. My argument would be that anti-Semitism, traditional anti-Semitism, was throughout Europe. It had never led to a Holocaust, that is, a genocide, mass murder. There had been, admittedly, there had been many persecutions, there had been much discrimination. There had even been expulsion of Jews from different countries in Europe. But before World War II, there had never been a calculated policy of genocide. And my argument would be that the reason that genocide developed in Nazi Germany was that their brand of anti-Semitism, the idea that the Jews were racially inferior. I mean, I cited the quotation that talked about that the Jews represented a racial tuberculosis in Germany, carries with it a kind of solution. You know, Hitler saw the German Jews as detrimental to German society. And once the war began, and that the politics of immigration could not be maintained, and once the invasion of Russia took place, where orders were given to kill people deliberately, it's a very small step to the idea that the final solution means killing all the Jews that are within your power. So I would base it, I would go from racial view of the world and the idea of the inferiority of a particular people. There's a closer connection to that, it seems to me, than traditional forms of anti-Semitism. The second question was about Italy. It's true that Italy, I mean, there had been traditional anti-Semitism in Italy. What happened in Italy was, it was true that the Italian government, as long as it stayed in power until 1943, tended to protect Italian Jews. And there were instances when Italian soldiers protected French Jews after Italy took over parts of France. And there were some Italian generals who said that to round up the Jews was beneath the honor of the Italian army, and they wouldn't do it. But see, Italy had a certain certain freedom, at least until 1903, that Mussolini was the ally of Hitler, and that the Germans essentially could ask and cajole the Italians to round up the Jews and send them on to camps. But there was no real way that they could enforce it until 1943, when Mussolini fell, was captured, then liberated by the Germans and established as kind of a puppet head of a German government in northern Italy. Then the Germans in Italy had to round up the Jews on their own. And the final question, David Duke, and so I don't, you know, I just don't see. There is certainly anti-Semitism in this country.
Well, I'm not specifically saying anti-Semitism, but we're seeing in a period of terrible financial hardship for a large proportion of the American population, we're seeing an increase in racist tendencies, not Jews, again, sending Haitians back to Haiti. I mean, we're seeing much, I'm starting to see close parallels between Germany in the 30s.
Well, I would certainly agree that that in tough economic times, discrimination happens more frequently. I think that's true. But in my mind, there's a giant step from discrimination to genocide. And it seems to me that David Duke, for all of his deficiencies, has never talked along the lines of genocide.
I just wanted to add something which might be of interest. Hitler's brand of anti-Semitism actually originates in Austria, and he imported it, took it to Germany when he moved to Germany. Now, most of you know that Austria is Catholic and not Protestant, so that didn't make much difference, because the brand of Vitupera's anti-Semitism was much worse, and still is today, much worse in Austria, still ongoing. In Austria more so than in Germany. So what Hitler did in terms of his interpretation and his racism, something which he brought with him from Austria, took what he found in Germany. In Germany there was actually a situation at that particular time, prior to World War I, but especially between World War I and II, was a increasing assimilation of Jewish people, acceptance of Jewish people, more so than in Austria. what he did is just stimulated a anti-Semitism which actually was getting a little bit more dormant in Germany.
Gene?
There were three windows of opportunity, so to speak, for the world, America in particular, to speak out in the mid-30s. In 1935, the American Baptists, there was an International Baptist Convention in Germany, and there was a movement within the American Baptist movements to boycott it. But they didn't. They went anyway. That was one. In 1936, there was the Olympic Games. There was a movement in the American Olympics. It outlined the complete legal mechanism with German law and international law for sanctions against Germany. As was quoted, one of his quotes in there, like, no longer can remain silent. They resigned. And nobody acted.
Well, just to comment on a couple of those points. Point first, the League had no power. I mean, in 1935, there was a major crisis over Ethiopia, and people talked about some pretty tame sanctions. They were really never carried out against Mussolini. And after 1935, nobody believed the League could do anything. And in fact, that was true. On the Olympics, I mean, it's very true that there was a discussion in the United States over whether the United States should participate in the Olympics. I suppose in many ways it can easily be argued that it was important for other countries in the world to go to the Olympics and in a certain way, if you want, in an athletic way, test the idea of differences between races. Yes, in the back.
In a forum such as this, I realize it's truly not to have a dialogue, particularly a question and answer type forum. But it does, and I appreciate very much the kind of the amazing amount of material you brought to bear this afternoon. At the same time, it does seem to me that emphasis on Hitler, or the emphasis on any individual, is a bias in certain historical circles, and particularly in the United States, where we tend to shy away from too many structural type analyses and focus on individuals bearing the guilt. I am not saying individuals don't bear the guilt. I am saying whenever you turn on television, for example, and watch explanations of any event, you will see always the thrust on identifying the individual. But I'd like to follow up on that young man's question, who brought in more phenomena. Because when you look at the material you presented, you see very marked structural matters that can be brought to bear on present-day situations, such as the amount of propaganda that was brought to bear in this country on the recent Iraq war, the unification or the attempts to what some people would call, in fact, you use the word solidarity, to bolster our own beliefs and our own righteousness. But I wonder if you would care to comment and speculate and play around a little bit with the notion of the contribution of positivism and science to the situation that developed in Europe following 1918 or even before. Positivism, romanticism in literature that contributed to this same strain, and the buying of economic systems in an attempt to establish hegemony in the world.
Yeah, well, I can structure that puts so much power into relatively few hands represents an extreme form of political power. I don't think it's wrong to stress, with regard to the Holocaust and the development of the final solution, the role that Hitler played. Now, I will admit that there is no single document that Hitler signed that called for the final solution. But from the moment of Hitler's political consciousness, right after World War I, until his death, his final testament portrays an astonishing anti-Semitic view of the world, which was constant for a period of about 25 years, 10 of which, or 12 of which, he exercised almost total power in Germany. And so in that particular case, I think that emphasizing the role of Hitler is valid. On the point of science, I didn't say anything about the German eugenics program. The idea of eugenics in Europe had developed at the end of the 19th century. It's related to your point about science. And Germany did practice, actually before the determination of the final solution, a eugenics program on German people, which was designed not to, it was a kind of a euthanasia program. It was designed not to alleviate suffering. It was designed to remove from Germany physically, by scientific means, people who were considered to be asocial, people who were too old, who were retarded, who refused to work. And in the period roughly between, about an 18-month period from 1940 to about August of 1941, something like 70,000 Germans were eliminated in a eugenics program that was partly carried out by lethal injection, partly carried out by gas. Hitler said in the 1930s, before the war, he talked about using the cover of the war to resolve certain problems of Germany. And part of the problems that he saw that he could resolve were questions of eugenics. It's interesting what happened to that program. Word leaked out. And from different parts of Germany, protests actually to Hitler. And he ended up stopping the program. That Hitler was, in a certain way, willing to use technology. And one of the lessons of the Holocaust is that the use of scientific technology, as it was used in the Holocaust, can in fact serve as a terrible weapon of the state. And so that, yeah, science is a part. I mean, the inappropriate use of science is a part of the whole series of events that we know as the Holocaust. I don't know, John, whether you have anything else. I think, I guess we're getting to where we promised we would leave. We're a few minutes over. But thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
Just incurably ill. Those who were viewed as incurably ill, not so much people who did not work. These people who refused to work were sent to concentration camps. But the ones who were considered to be incurably ill, mentally ill, or defective in one, insane, whatever you, these people then were subject to the euthanasia program, which was stopped by virtue of the fact that